While I get my piece of paper, let me first say that if you see me doze off during any later presentation today, that is certainly not because I find them boring, but rather because I had only 3 hours of sleep last night because I just arrived this morning. So just beforehand, I don't want you to start paying attention to whether or not I'm sleeping later on in the day, but just as an explanation beforehand, you know what the reason is, and I think if you're honest, you can all understand that. Right, I was asked to talk about Salafism, which is really my academic specialty, and the relationship between the Islamic State and Salafism. Now, one of the interesting things that is happening with regard to the Islamic State is that one question is being asked, and has been asked many times, for example, in a very famous article by Graham Wood in the Atlantic Monthly: is the Islamic State Islamic? Now, I always find that a bit of a strange question, and certainly one that I, as a non-Muslim academic, should stay away from. I think Muslims make Islam, and I just don't express my opinion about that. But it's a bit of a silly question to me, because the overwhelming majority of Muslims obviously denounces the Islamic State. But what is perhaps more interesting, and that is what I would like to focus on, is what the relationship not between Islam and the Islamic State is, but between Salafism and the Islamic State. Now, just a few days ago, I'll just get the article, I received an email of a scholar saying the following about this question, and this just happened 3 days ago. And this is typical of how many Salafis look at this question. If I were to ask this question in front of a Salafi audience, and I've done that many times, it's very typical to get an answer like this. This is a Salafi scholar speaking, and he says about this question, the title of the article is "Terrorists Are the Worst of Creation," so you can guess which way he's going. There's a very strong tendency among Salafis to dissociate Salafism in every which way from the practices of the Islamic State. And one can imagine why, of course. The overwhelming majority of Salafis do not like the Islamic State, see in the Islamic State their biggest fears realized. To say they use violence, they use terrorism, they use bombings, all of this stuff that we do not use, and we have nothing to do with the Islamic State whatsoever. Okay, just my luck, the article is not loading, but you'll take my word for it. What he is saying, what many Salafis have told me during my fieldwork in various Muslim countries, is that they say there is no such thing, for example, as jihadi Salafism. You shouldn't even call them that way. You should call them Khawarij, extremists, or whatever, but you shouldn't call them Salafism. It's as if Salafism is a sort of brand name that they want to keep clean of all that sort of stuff. And once again, one can imagine why. As a researcher, however, it is important for me not just to look at one group of Salafis, but to define Salafism as a whole and to see who fits into that definition. That is what I am trying to do, even though Salafism is very often painted with a very broad brush and associated with these things. Now, first of all, I'm going to define Salafism, then give some conceptual expressions of what Salafism is all about. Then, how do these conceptual expressions of Salafism appear in IS's publications, most particularly the magazine Dabiq? Then, of course, there are Salafi claims against the Islamic State, and jihadi Salafism is even contested among several scholars. And I'll end with some conclusions. Now, first of all, defining Salafism. One of the things Salafis very often say is that, well, we are not a branch of Islam, we are Islam in all its purity. So to say that, Salafism is a branch of Islam that, and then to continue, is wrong in the eyes of many Salafis anyway. I'm going to do that anyway by starting with the branch within Sunni Islam, whose adherents claim to emulate the pious predecessors as Salaf as-Salih, usually equated with the first 3 generations of Islam, as strictly and in as many spheres of life as possible. Obviously, the name Salafism is derived from the word as-Salaf as-Salih, which means the pious predecessors. The hadith on which they base this is that the Prophet Muhammad says, "Qarni, my generation, or khayr al-nas, qarni, the best of people are my generation, thumma ladhina yalunahum, and then the ones who follow them, ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ, and then the ones who follow them, suggesting that the first 3 generations of Muslims are indeed the best people of all. So this is how I define Salafism. How is this expressed conceptually? What are the important concepts of Salafism and how are they explained? First of all, in the theological sphere, there is a very strong focus on the concept of Tawheed, already mentioned by Omar just now. And you might say, well, this is something that all Muslims have in common, the belief in one God, which is obviously true, but Salafis go a lot further than that, saying we also believe in Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah, the unity of divinity, as it were, or also referred to as Tawheed al-Ibadah, the unity of worship, meaning that nothing else can be worshipped apart from God. Again, that sounds like generally Islamic, but Salafis have a strong tendency, for example, to reject Shiite Islam because they say, they worship Ali, they worship Hussein, worshipping graves, for example, worshipping saints. All of these are practices that are vehemently rejected by Salafis. Another dimension of Tawheed that they use is Tawheed al-Asma wa Sifat, the idea that God is completely unique and one in all his names and attributes, and that nothing can possibly be ascribed to God that is similar to what we have. For example, it says in the Quran, لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ, there is nothing like him. As A.J. Arbery translated is like him there is naught, which is a nice way of translating it, I think. And Salafis on the basis of that say, well, if the Quran says that God has hands, or a leg, or eyes, which the Quran does say, how are we supposed to interpret that? Well, Salafis say God is completely unique, utterly unique, so if he has hands, apparently he does, because that's what the Quran says, but he doesn't have hands like these. That's impossible. So Salafis have a tendency to say, we read these verses bila kayfa, without knowing and understanding how they should be interpreted. So they're very strict when it comes to theology and the idea of Tawheed. Also, they have very specific ideas on Iman, faith, and Kufr, unbelief. I could give a very long talk about this. I will not do that, but Salafis generally believe that Iman, that faith, is found in the heart, al-i'tiqad bil-qalb, conviction in the heart, and qawl bil-lisan, speech with the tongue, and acts with the limbs, al-a'mal bil-jawarih. And they believe that any violation in any of these 3 spheres leads you to become a kafir. It's a bit more complicated than that, but you'll forgive me for not going into that more specifically. In the sphere of law, Salafis are generally, not absolutely, but generally against the application of taqleed, the blind emulation of the schools of Islamic law, already mentioned by Omar again. It was a nice thing that you went first, so I can periodically refer to your talk. And they are in favor of ijtihad, of directly and independently interpreting the sources themselves, and the sources are indeed the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. Thirdly, one way in which Salafism expresses itself conceptually is its identity. There is a strong emphasis on the concept of al-wala wal-bara. Loyalty, al-wala, towards Muslims, towards Islam, and towards God on the one hand, and al-bara, disavowal towards the others. Just to promote A.J. Arbery's translation of the Quran again, in Quran 60 verse 4 says, Inna bura'a'u minkum, and a lot more of course, but A.J. Arbery translates, we are quit of you, which I also, nice translation. Not related to me, and I don't make any money by promoting his translation of the Quran, I just really like that. And they very much reject other Islamic trends. If you go to a Salafi website, you will very often see a list of groups that Salafis claim that they are not. Salafis have a great tendency to define themselves by saying who they are not. We are not the Nation of Islam, we are not Shiites, we are not the Khawarij, we are not the Murja, we are not the, and so on and so on. Even groups that have not existed for a long time. For example, the Mu'tazila have not answered the email for several centuries, but Salafis nevertheless see the need to define themselves as not being Mu'tazila. And finally, scholars. Several of these scholars obviously are important to many Muslims, including Ibn Hanbal, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Ibn Taymiyyah, and Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyya. Ibn Hanbal was an 8th, 9th century scholar, Ibn Taymiyyah 13th, 14th, and Ibn al-Qayyim as well. And depending on the different branches of Salafism, there are also modern scholars that they claim for themselves. So this is how Salafism is expressed conceptually. It's not just Tawheed, but a specific interpretation of Tawheed. It's not just al-wala wal-bara, but a very strict interpretation of al-wala wal-bara, etc. Now, if we look at Salafism, how it's expressed in the Islamic State's publications, we can see that when it comes to theology, there is indeed a very strong emphasis on Tawheed. This was expressed not just in the journal, but also, for example, when they went to Palmyra in Syria, they destroyed all the statues and the ancient relics, and to them this was an expression of Tawheed, of doing what the Prophet Muhammad himself is said to have done when he conquered Mecca in 630, according to Islamic tradition. And they also have very specific views on Iman and Kufr, and they are expressed in Dabiq as well. So you can see very clearly that the ideas that the Islamic State adheres to on an ideological level, on a level of aqidah, of creed, is very similar to what Salafis in general say. When it comes to law, they don't really argue directly against blind emulation of the schools of Islamic law, against taqlid, but their constant references to the Quran and the Sunnah, rather than to scholars who are important scholars of any particular school of law, suggest that they do support ijtihad. When it comes to identity, it is very clear that they lay claim to the mantle and to the title of Salafism. They claim to be Salafis. Now, I very much understand that the term Salafi is a claim that many people want to use for themselves. To some extent, the word Salafi even means authentic to a lot of Muslims. I want to be like the Salaf, right? Because many other Muslims who are not Salafis also believe that these first generations of Muslims are indeed very good, the Prophet Muhammad, of course, being the best of them. But they do so in a very, very explicit way, and they really portray themselves as successors, not so much to the Ottoman Empire, the last caliphate, if you wish, but to the Rashidun, al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, to the rightly guided caliphs, the first four. And finally, the scholars that they mention are exactly those that Salafis in general mention, not just Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyyah, but also Ibn Hanbal, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and also modern scholars that are typical of them, such as Abu al-Mundhir al-Shinqiti, for example. Now, you might say, well, that's easy then, the Islamic State, Salafi. Well, yes and no. As I said before, the overwhelming majority of Salafis would not agree with this. They would say, look, our manhaj, our method of acting with society, of reading the sources, is very different from what the Islamic State does. So there is a clear division between quietist, non-political, non-violent Salafis on the one hand, and the Islamic State on the other. But how about jihadi Salafism? How do these two groups, for example, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, relate to one another? Now, there are some who say the Islamic State have nothing to do with jihadi Salafism at all. A man called Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who, to plug my own work, I've written a book on, has said this in an interview. He has said they have nothing to do with jihadi Salafism whatsoever. And he says, well, in the creed there are strong similarities, but in the manhaj, in the method of applying this, there are really very, very clear differences, and one should not equate the Islamic State with jihadi Salafism. This is what some jihadi Salafis say. And just like their quietist brethren, they say the Islamic State are actually Khawarij. For those of you who don't know, the Khawarij was an early Islamic group that broke away from the Muslim community in the year 657 at the Battle of Siffin and rebelled against Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth caliph, and eventually murdered him, in fact, or assassinated him, I should say. There are many scholars who say this, who say the Islamic State are Khawarij, which is a clever way of saying, well, we still think they're Muslims, but they're extremist Muslims. And labeling people in a quick way is a very effective way of vilifying them, as it were. Rebellion, yes, that's good. Rebellion against the rulers who do not apply Islamic law, for example, in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia or in Tunisia or wherever, all of that is good, but not on the basis of the ideas of the Islamic State. Yet the ideas of the Islamic State on kufr and iman are virtually identical, except for some exceptions, as those of other jihadi Salafis. So again, in the area of creed, there are strong similarities, or even it's completely identical. Moreover, the Islamic State themselves have written at least one long document in which they say, we are not Khawarij. Right? So you may think, well, they are, but they themselves say, no, we are not. So even they don't want the label Khawarij to be applied to them. The American terrorism scholar J.M. Berger said, if you need a 60-page document to show that you are not Khawarij, you're probably Khawarij. I don't know if that's true, but they did write a very long document proving, quote unquote, that they are not Khawarij. And there is a very interesting internal debate going on between what you might call, and I mean this between scare quotes, the moderate Islamic State scholars and the ones who are, well, perhaps less so, who are claimed by other members of the Islamic State as being Khawarij. So even within the Islamic State there is discussion about this, and some people have actually been executed for being extremists. And if members of the Islamic State think you're extremists, well. So, let's move on to contesting jihadi Salafism. Generally speaking, the Islamic State is contested when it comes to jihadi leadership. Many jihadi Salafi scholars, such as Abu Basir al-Tartusi, Abu Qatada al-Filistini, Sayyid Imam, Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, many of these sort of like the classics of jihadi Salafism, say the Islamic State is taking Al-Qaeda's place. We had a good thing going with Al-Qaeda. It spread all over the Muslim world, and now you're wrecking this. And people like Al-Maqdisi and Abu Qatada al-Filistini have even expressed in The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, because you have a British newspaper, you have a newspaper called The Guardian as well, right? Mailing Guardian, right, okay. See, I know that. But they said, we had a good thing going with Al-Qaeda, and suddenly you take its place. That's not the proper way to do it. Moreover, the proper way to express loyalty to the caliph is through bay'ah, through an oath of fealty. And that has not been done properly. Why not? Because this should really be done by all the scholars together. But who has expressed his bay'ah to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the man on the screen over there? It was just, these are just tulab ilm, these are just seekers of knowledge. They're not really scholars. So the people who have made sure that the caliph of the Islamic State, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, enjoys a certain degree of legitimacy, have been criticized for not being true scholars. And the idea that they are a caliphate is just wrong. They say, look, a caliphate should be something for all Muslims, not for a small group of Muslims who've claimed this. The caliphates in the past, at least in theory, were for all Muslims, and the caliph should indeed be the leader of the faithful, the Amir al-Mu'mineen, and not just a small group of faithful. They also say the Islamic State's policy choices are just utterly wrong. What they do is they use random violence, far too many victims. I've seen images myself of adherents to Al-Qaeda or followers of Al-Qaeda being accused of being kuffar, of unbelievers. Now, the difference between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda ideologically is this big. So if you accuse people like that of being kuffar, then according to many Muslims, you are really taking it a bit too far. And they are using unnecessary violence. Many jihadi Salafi scholars are saying, look, if you're against, let's say, cinemas showing pornographic films, by all means protest against it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to kill the people responsible for that, right? If you are against Shiites, doesn't necessarily mean you have to kill them, right? You can also call on them to change their ways. So the idea that there is unnecessary violence going on is another main difference between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And thirdly, and this is interesting, the Islamic State is accused of sullying and dirtying the image, which supposedly clean image, of jihadi Salafism, and of waging jihad simply for jihad's sake. Jihad should be waged, according to jihadi Salafi scholars, for a better society, for the application of the Sharia, for a truly Islamic state, not simply because you want to wage jihad. And as such, they are accused of losing sight of the big picture. It's not about saying, I fight, therefore I exist, but it's really about establishing an Islamic state. That is the end goal. Jihad is a means and not an end in itself. And this discussion, interestingly, is part of a context of discussions between jihadi Salafis, who I refer to as the scholars, between quotes, and the fighters, the scholars are the ones who believe that scholarly trained people should decide what a jihad should look like, whereas the fighters believe that they have a special responsibility as fighters, as people who are actually dodging the bullets and fighting the fight. They have a special responsibility and special knowledge to decide about this. The scholars say, look, we should decide about this because we are learned people, we know about the Sharia, we know about Islam, we know what the rules are, so you should stick to our rules. The fighters believe that they should do that. And what you see in the Islamic State is really that the scholars no longer act as a guardian of the jihad that they are fighting, but that the Islamic State is really the ultimate fighter-driven group. They've taken this idea that fighters are the ultimate arbiters of what jihad should look like to its most extreme extent. That they are really the heirs of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, the man who founded the first precursor of the Islamic State in 1999, and he was the exemplification, as it were, of a fighter-driven jihad who said, I know better than many scholars because I am actually doing the fighting. And the Islamic State is sort of the organized vision of that. So, to answer the question, Salafism, in its most important conceptual expressions, is actually pervasive in the Islamic State's publications. And the fact that the overwhelming majority of Salafis do not agree with the Islamic State and would never commit terrorist attacks as they do does not change that fact, because it is indeed a fact. Secondly, ideological differences between the Islamic State on the one hand and other jihadi Salafis on the other do exist, but virtually only in manhaj, in the way it is applied, not so much in aqidah. Does that mean that the concept of tawheed is inherently wrong? No. But it does mean that there is something different about what the Islamic State does with these concepts in practice. Thirdly, these things are also related to the Islamic State's strategy, to their tactics, to their general outlook of what jihadi Salafism should be and what it should be about, and what the future holds. Right? Should we be in perpetual jihad, or should we eventually found an Islamic State in which all Muslims can find a home? And finally, you might say that the Islamic State is a fighter-driven jihadis whose policies are not new. They go back a few years. You might say that they're even rooted in for example, the Groupe Islamique Armé, the Jia, fighting in the 1990s in Algeria. But they're very, very controversial among jihadi Salafis. So are they Salafi? Yes, but even within jihadi Salafism, they represent an extreme group. Thank you very much.